Welcome, folks. Today with us, we have Ryan Cooke, one of the OGs from Pinterest. Ryan has been working at Pinterest for several years and have been leading a lot of mobile and client teams. So we'll dive into how developer experience at Pinterest looks like. Obviously, we'll focus more on clients specifically. So before we get started, Ryan, maybe you can do a quick introduction yourself, and we'll dive straight into the topic of DevX at Pinterest.
Sure. I'm glad to be here. I wouldn't quite describe myself as OG at Pinterest. I've been 8.5 years at Pinterest, which is a very long time by tech standards, but there was about 1,000 people when I joined. So a lot of it was already built before I got there. But I manage a group of 5 teams. We call it Client Fundamentals, and we own a lot of these things that are necessary to keep the app going. These are things like mobile builds, but actually also making sure people log accurately, making sure that they can debug crashes and operate productively. So I think that we have a lot of thoughts in the space.
Very cool. So, talking about developer experience at Pinterest, share a little bit about like how maybe the organization is structured. Kind of like how does the clients fit into all of that? Is there like a formal structure of developer experience org within Pinterest, or sort of like more tiger team style?
Yeah. So we have kind of a foundations type group that works on generally developer productivities. It's more anything behind the scenes. So like I don't know if I'd call performance developer productivity, but that falls under this foundation umbrella. And it definitely has some overlap. So this foundation ones then break down into a client focused group, client foundations, and we have emphasis on each platform as well as a few teams split out to areas that really require specialists. So we have like an Android platform, iOS platform, and they could do things like moving us to Swift, for example. Um, while then specialized teams like mobile builds is cross platforms, but really works on kind of where can we share and build these synergies. And then zooming back out again, there is over on the infra org more of a developer productivity pure focus. They drive things like the surveys, the measurements, looking into our statistics and kind of consistency throughout the company. Um, we leverage kind of what we can from them and also specialize it to our area.
Amazing. So, what is special about mobile that makes it hard to kind of like scale? I know there are very few companies out there who have those big mobile engineering teams even today. So maybe share a little bit about like, how do you think about developer experience for mobile? Kind of like, are there different components to it? I understand like there are builds, which are a big part of it, but like, is there anything else in that too?
Yeah, so I think the first and probably most unique thing about mobile is that you're so tied into these big companies' ecosystems. So Apple and Google for iOS and Android. That leads to a couple things. I think the one that probably has the most repercussions in my mind is that we do weekly releases and we consider that pretty good. I think that's about as good as it gets in the industry is be able to release weekly on mobile. And that's terrible by web standards. Um, and suddenly that kind of shifts the whole perspective a lot on like how do you care if something comes up in the middle of the week? Like, do you need to kind of get the CI? What can you shift differently? But those weekly releases matter more. So we get into this kind of hybrid type release cycle. But also being locked into ecosystem, especially on the Apple side, leads to things like we have to do our builds on Mac machines. And Xcode is our development environment, whether we like it or not. And sure, there's ways to asterisk around all of those things, but that gives us a starting point that's fairly unique. I think the last element I would say is mobile's not like the newest, trendiest thing anymore, but especially these are 10-year-old apps. So they were really built a lot of the core of it before best practices were established. We were on Android built out a list that could display pins performantly because the list in Android was not performant enough. So there's a lot of the like you had to build these base components yourself just because they didn't exist in the ecosystem and there was not best practices, and that affects how the whole ecosystem works a lot for developers.
how does the tooling of these mobile platforms have evolved in the kind of like last few years, and kind of like what does gold standard look like today? Like what do we strive for? What are like the tool ecosystems today for mobile teams?
Sure. So let's see. I think that's a lot of direction I can go with that, but let's start with kind of the build aspect of it. I think that first, just kind of measured and understood builds is a very basic thing, and it's not easy to achieve. I still tend to recommend and stick towards these very standard builds, the like Gradle on Android and kind of the Xcode type builds on iOS. Bazel's popular. You're going to get faster, more deterministic builds than Bazel, which sounds fundamentally better. But my recommendations, especially for people with smaller teams, is that you're also going to just have more headaches and you're going to have to do more to maintain those. So I think that the kind of blessed systems on the builds are probably the way for most people to go until they have kind of the staffing and ability to move away from them. Um, then I guess kind of getting away from that, say testing for productivity. Um, Fundamentally, there's a few things that you'll see that are standard. Like we still care about the test pyramid. I think that mobile tends to not do unit testing as well. I think that it was only last 5 years or so that Google especially started saying like, okay, we're opinionated on how you should build a test, and here's a way to build it in a way that can be unit tested. So there's often a lot of debt around that and just kind of how you architect it. Um, but unit test should be your next one. And then I think UI testing tends to be a very easy where you bring up the app, have it click around. A pretty important step to any mobile ecosystem testing. Um, they're always going to be a little bit flaky, and people should build around that, or some understanding that UI tests are just not perfect. Firebase Test Lab used to be the gold standard on that, at least especially on Android. But now we build both of those in-house, and kind of that was a reliability. I don't know if I can recommend to everybody at home to just build your own UI testing system, but we've been able to create better stability and better control of our resourcing needs there. What other fun parts are there in the tool chain? Any other tools that came to mind when you're asking that question?
Yeah. So I think maybe kind of like just diving into Bazel itself, there
Mm-hmm.
are a lot of interesting things that people are doing with Bazel, but like also like we have noticed that it's very language specific support, and like support can sometimes be very, or like how well Bazel supports a particular programming language can be a little bit all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, kind of like, how is your experience? Like, do you folks use Bazel for iOS?
We do not, but we were one of the first to use it. I don't pretend to be a Bazel pro, but I at least know kind of the story on all of these. This is perhaps the manager's perspective on all of these things. But we were one of the first adopters on Bazel, in some ways too early on it, where we had built out Bazel support, and it was fast, it was good, it was reliable, except for every year Apple would release a new Xcode version, and it was a nightmare to get the compatibility. We'd have to be like reading
Hmm.
deep into the code. And I think now there's like better Bazel adoption. So if you there's more best practices and more like, okay, we know not to touch this part of the chain. But because of that, we had and at the time we had one person working on mobile builds. So we found this just didn't seem like it was the right way to support until we staff it up more. So we are not using Bazel.
Okay. So kind of like maybe also, given that we're talking about modern tooling, and I feel like it's hard to do a podcast without talking about AI. Maybe you can share kind of like, have you seen any interesting AI tools that are specific to mobile? I believe there are probably some who are trying to do mobile testing. Have you seen any success with that? Are you kind of like internally trying some sort of like AI experiments to run better testing?
Yeah, we've done quite a few on AI. I wish I had the numbers offhand, but I recall there was an internal survey asking kind of like how many hours per week AI saves you, and mobile was below the curve on that, I would say, internally. So there's still some learning to do, and this kind of goes back to our earlier point that, especially like the Xcode Apple ecosystem, you can use the Apple's AI, but I don't know what that will solve for you. They have some work to do there, and I think we have GitHub Copilots generally elsewhere. Um, People have found niche use cases. I find that junior developers are using kind of these AI coding tools more, and yet to see whether that's a good thing. I can kind of imagine two worlds where one of them, they look at the senior developers and it's like, we don't know how to Google, and be like, there's they have a few hacks. And one that somebody taught me that I thought was really neat was they put in a comment saying like, this is a regular expression to find a phone number or whatever, and then the co-pilots completed it based on the comments, and a couple tricks like that. So
Nice.
we've seen that for coding. For testing, unit tests especially, we've seen success in writing that for it. That depends on kind of the architecture being very unit testable, but we haven't leaned into that at scale, but the developers know this is a way that you can save some time writing unit tests and do it. So we've seen some value there. Then what else on AI have we done? I think we've considered, this is on web especially. We're currently using Cypress for our UI testing on web. And web, there's a lot of good UI testing frameworks. We'd like to be able to play around with them. Playwright continues to gain popularity. And our early tests and our kind of opinions, it looks like we might be able to really cut down kind of adoption and trial of tooling like that using AI. And I think that's where I'm pretty excited for AI. And I think there's the biggest opportunity is one of my teams actually, their job is essentially to make migration successful. We found that, the apps are over a decade old. We were often having to do these large migrations to, I mentioned before, like use Swift, and it's just huge. A lot of developers just rewriting a whole lot of code. We previously had a model where we would ask product teams to like move their features and such, but that had a lot of pushback from the business because product teams have important work to do as well. So we've started kind of staffing a team to like help push these things to the finish line. And I think there's a real opportunity and space there to help these migrations go faster, as well as these migrations that you might have just not seen as worth it. I think type spec is often a demo, although type spec is great, but it's often a demo of AI tooling. And while we migrated to type spec before AI coding was cool, I'm eyeing kind of those type of migrations of the like, we didn't want to fund this because it was going to be a lot of time. But now if we can do a way to fund it, get just small changes and have some sort of test apparatus to make sure AI didn't create pure nonsense in our code, we'd be excited. There's definitely some hesitation, everything from kind of using copyrighted code to these like just unpredictable behavior.
Right.
But we're optimistic. We're eager to find the wins, and we're also eager to not force people to use AI if they don't want to, and find that balance of, I think I was saying earlier, the junior developers who like are definitely leaning into it more. I could see this world where they're better at just coding than everybody. They know how to Google when we don't, is the analogy in my mind. But I also worry that they're just missing this problem solving and this
The
skill set that,
fundamentals.
yeah. So we'll see how that plays out. I think I relied a lot in Stack Overflow and Google throughout my coding experience. So I don't have a pretense you need to know everything, but it's a different way.
Right. Very interesting. And I think, like, yeah, especially with AI tools, I've noticed that at least today, you need a lot more supervision. I think there is definitely like a lot of wins that are happening, but like the wins are happening when you consider these AI tools as assistants rather than kind of like in the driver's seat, right?
And I think at apps, kind of the complexity of Pinterest and such, we're going to be in that world for a while, I suspect. I think that suddenly these projects that were a lot of people were a pain, nobody wanted to work on, will be a lot faster, but there's still going to be suddenly the new layer of like, how did I make sure the AI didn't make a SQL vulnerability or kind of do
Right,
something dumb in this migration?
right, right.
Yeah, so definitely some limitations, and there's yeah, we've looked into even like, can we give it a lot of context window of our own code so it knows like how to match the style? But
Right.
there's opportunity, but even just the integration into our tooling needs some more work. But I'm excited to see where we can go with it.
Okay, so maybe share a little bit about developer environments. I can imagine for mobile that can be very complicated.
Yeah, so I think that we're typically fairly restricted, especially for Apple builds that you need to be on Macs. And Android, it's pretty customary to build on Macs as well. I think everybody's used to it. It's a lot of documentation. It's going to be much harder to follow if you're not on a Mac. So everything is built locally on Macs, at least for developers. We've really flirted with remote builds, especially on Android. There's some things to do there, but overall, we've found that really kind of the best environment and the best way to get people good builds is get them the newest laptop we can. And we have a faster upgrade policy for mobile developers than anybody else at Pinterest, because so much of it is built locally and laptops continue to get better. So that's often been we're hoping that the quality of laptops can outscale performance challenges. And I would recommend that to anyone at home, that your most cost efficient way to get your mobile developers to be faster is get them a beefy Mac Pro and update it as quickly as you can. Beyond that, with remote work, there is some kind of environment challenges that, so we give everybody a little bit of budget and things like that to set up. But we've started more and more exploring. We used to be all Bay Area, and we're still very West Coast focused, but kind of figuring out remote caches and how to do it across time zones and things like that. But those are, hopefully developers don't have to think about the remote cache very much, is kind of our goal for a lot of those toolings.
Nice. What's a typical lifetime of a laptop for a mobile developer?
2 years is our typical path, and it's not even for everybody else, you kind of have to ask to be upgraded. On mobile developers, we tell them like, is there any reason we should not upgrade you? We want to upgrade you, and we've had a few people fight us. We've had a few dilemmas. Like, I know people have really liked their like 13-inch really thin laptops, and we're like, okay, but here's your build speeds versus everybody else at the company, and
Nice,
really had to convince them to use something more powerful.
nice. I'm sure most developers are still happy with the newer laptop, though.
Yeah, I think so. I think that we don't have a lot of resistance, and we've even used it as bait to get people to be like, hey, we're trying something in build. We don't know if it will work. We want some people to enable it. If you do, we'll put you on top of the laptop upgrade list. So often that's a balance factor.
Very cool. All right. Switching gears a little bit. Would love to hear how Pinterest, like developer experience for clients specifically, has evolved. I know you've been there for a long time. Maybe you can share kind of like what were some of the bigger projects that your team or worked on, kind of like, how should like, even listeners think about if there are some accomplishments, some goals they have, how should they kind of like, uh, plan it out, scope it out, especially with smaller teams?
Sure. Yeah, I think this one is fairly passionate to me because before I worked at Pinterest, I was on a 3-person Android team, and 9-person engineering team. So kind of thinking of like, what is the path from the very beginning? I definitely got to see some of that evolution. I would say in the abstract way, there's a very common pattern. So we started out with just a core team, or at least that's when I joined. There was just a core team that is generally own everything that's not product things for the app. And you're going to have to get there eventually as a company. I wouldn't rush companies to build a core team. I think as soon as you have a core team, suddenly these things become not the job of other people. And the longest you can keep, like, everybody cares about having a good build experience and thinks about testing and things like that, the easier it is to like bring everyone's things. But once you start having these core and fundamental groups, you have specialists in it, and other people are like, oh, that's a job for this team to solve.
At what
But
point did Pinterest had it? Like when was it formed?
it was formed before I joined, so I can't give you an exact date, but I would guess with so let's see, I joined kind of early on. We were just expanding Android internationally. I would say probably 20 developers per platform, something like that was when I'd
Okay.
guess it was formed.
Okay.
Um, but then I think the pattern of kind of what I see for these developer items is, first it's kind of everybody's job. So let's use build. That's the easy universal one. You want to have fast local build speeds. First, it's everybody's job, and when that's the case, you'll find a couple people who it's actually they're the ones who do it, and those are the people that end up on the platform teams eventually, and the heroes who take the work that someone's really got to do. Um, but then, kind of as that grows, just having this person solve it when there's a problem becomes super unsustainable. There's just too many things to know, too many things to do. So often it becomes a full-time job. And if we're being realistic, how these patterns actually always happen for something is build becomes unsustainable, or some other thing that you need to get on a platform level is, you're having too many crashes, you're having too many out of memories, you're having too much. So first you do the let's get this back to the healthy line, and you build the measurements and you get somebody fully staffed in front of it. So then I guess you fix the problem, you build some ability to really understand it better. Maybe one of those comes before the other, depending on where you are. And then the job becomes, can you keep stuff in the same spot that you are? We have an internal number we've used a few times, that for builds, they get 36 seconds slower every month that we don't work on them. Um, so that's kind of like the P90 number, something like that. But we learned that because we took people off of it for 3 months, and we're like, so that's the trend line. And it becomes often thankless work that you're trying to rush against. And just how do you maintain this? How do you keep it? But to the kind of initial question, so you've staffed up, you have one person focused on it. At some point, it just becomes too much. I've heard the 1 to 5 ratio kind of for platforms, not terrible. 1 to 4, 1 to 5. I don't have a perfect number in mind. I think there's a little bit of that. There's a little bit of like, how much debt did you take on early on that you need to pay off, and balance it there. Um,
Very cool.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so kind of like other than build times, what, like if you have like any projects or things that you worked on in the last few years that provided like some of the better wins for developer experience.
Sure. So I think that a lot of it's kind of just about visibility. So I think, for example, performance. Performance matters a lot to any time you ship an experiment. But when I joined, we had some performance metrics in production. So the workflow was something along the lines of, you ship an experiment, you ship a project, and then honestly, it was even later than that. It was suddenly we get an alert that the startup time on Pinterest is slower. Um, so what we did was, we're like, that's not that useful. We can't be retroactively responding to these. So we, like I said in the pattern before, we solved that problem. We built better metrics so that we could understand more nuance, kind of where it was. And we put in controls for before you actually do it. So with this, we have performance testing that just would open the app, it would run it in a very controlled environment. And that way, on a per PR level, you could actually see, at least through some key flows, hey, something looks slow in the performance here. What's going on? And then we also incorporated that into our experiment framework. We have an in-house experiment framework and that will also say this experiment seems to be slowing things down, so we don't have to solve it there. I think that's likely been the theme of a lot of what I've done. Next kind of big project I worked on was metric quality. This was right before we IPO'd, and we wanted to make sure that our logging was right. And again, we could find out in production that's like, wow, our impressions doubled. That doesn't seem right. And then we'd go back and we'd see kind of what was going on. But for that one, we actually built up our first kind of really robust test system. It was UI testing, which I would probably not recommend as your first robust test system if I were at a startup. But the same kind of theme of we built that and we shift a lot of the problems as left as possible so that typically we're mostly stuck at the PR level. I think I'd love to have more of these in the IDE themselves. But before you do a PR, you know that you didn't break the metrics. You know that you didn't hurt performance. And I see these as huge developer productivity gains because it used to be, you have to go into a war room investigation and there's a whole lot of people trying to figure out what the cause is. For what often were very mundane, you updated a library and kind of you can't have those things where it's like I'm scared to update libraries because I don't know the impact. So getting these visibilities and shifting left has been a big focus of what I've done at Pinterest. I can give a few more examples, but that's the
Yeah,
theme.
so I mean, there's obviously like regressions where kind of like some of these metrics went bad. Just kind of like maybe expanding on that a little bit. Like there is, how do you even do your long-term planning as sort of like this mobile platform, I will call it, as a team? Because like obviously, reducing build times and making your app load times better, those are like to a certain degree you can improve them. Some of those things can also be like retroactive where it's like, okay, the build times have gone up, or like the performance is going down, so we need to work on it. But like what about like proactive work? Like how do you do planning for that? Are there specific things that you're measuring when it comes to like maybe developer experience or any other metrics that helps guide for your long-term planning?
Yeah, so the planning on the group is very kind of developer bottom up. We rarely have executives coming in and saying like you need to make build times better. That's your number one priority now. Um, so from that we have surveys, and this has taken several forms over the years, but we try to keep as much of a pulse on kind of where are the pain points, what is slowing developers down. And I think there's often uh, nuance to that. I think anybody who's run a survey finds that even like the time of day, did you send it after a code freeze when everybody's annoyed or such? So the finding that, but we take that as a data endpoint. And I think in parallel, we have generally a platform vision that we work with like the highest ICs in the group to drive the like, here's where we want this platform to be in 2 years. So it tends to be a little bit of a balance of executing against a platform vision. I mentioned migrating to Swift. That's kind of a very easy 2 year, we got to do it. This is important, large project. But then we would be balancing that from people want snapshot testing or want kind of builds to be faster. So maybe we could look into a remote cache or something like that. And from there, it's a lot of just kind of talking to customers, talking to partners and developers to try to see what's going to give them the biggest boost.
Very interesting. So you're saying like a lot of this feedback comes directly from developers. Do you ever get to a point where it's like, okay, we don't have enough bandwidth. Maybe we can pull in some product team developers to actually like work on something like this.
We always don't have enough bandwidth. I would say that there's always more projects to do than opportunity. We have brought in product developers in the past. We, for kind of time sensitive, essential things, we would pull them in. Now we have a fairly robust platform group, so we will often shift kind of maybe take some people from this. We've also surged, I'm using a Swift example a lot. I'm only supporting that, but for Swift, for example, instead of kind of I know I talked to some other companies, and I've heard they like completely stopped all development for a year and got all the product developers on it.
Wow.
I don't know if it's publicly cited or not, so I'm not going to name the company, but um, rather than something extreme like that, we took a balanced approach where we put in a lot of things, and then we hired a large amount of contractors to kind of like, we have core people who built out, here's the plan, here's how every screen will go, but we're going to just have a lot more iOS developers than normal to achieve these things. So we have a few ways to make sure that we kind of, if we are too underwater, if we find something is very essential and needs to be done, we make sure it gets done.
Very cool. All right. So switching gears again,
Sure.
you mentioned a little bit about your release cycle is roughly once a week, which is kind of like, yes, I at least most of the mobile teams people I've spoken with, that's pretty good. So
Mhm.
is there something you do or follow, like certain practices which make this possible? And maybe you can kind of like share, are there like different, what is like a typical release process like?
Sure. A lot of it's just having it robust. I think when I've talked to other big companies who haven't got there, I think that the biggest thing that's keeping them from getting to the weekly release cycle is not having been at the weekly release cycle. And what I mean by that is that they're used to, so I talked to a company that had a monthly release cycle, and every release was such a big deal, and they kind of became a big fire drill. A lot of things went wrong. They had to fix a lot of patches. Everybody was really struggling to get all their commits into that release, that it got unstable. And because of that, kind of they had a like, this is always takes us a lot of like behind the scenes, a lot of work to get this release out. How could we release more quickly? But the reality is, when you're releasing kind of at this weekly cadence, people aren't rushing quite as much as if the monthly is to get the feature in. There's just less to go in. So that's like kind of just having the confidence to move to it, I think was one of the biggest pieces. But I don't want to undersell. We still have we have a suite of tests that run per commit to make sure that kind of nothing breaks. We have, then what we do is we do the branch cut every Friday. We do that, and then we supplement it with testing in India over the weekend that does a very robust, including kind of a lot of scripts as well as exploratory testing to catch very odd edge cases. And then we will do a gradual rollout throughout the week, which we pay very close attention to kind of any crashes that come up with the new versions, as well as we tend to be very aggressive with experiments gating new work. So that gives us a way to remotely turn off liabilities that come out. So a combination of that, because we're weekly, we don't have too much going out per week, and those series of controls have made it possible. And then just good connections with Apple, especially Apple, who tends to sometimes be slow with Apple with reviews and understanding what's going on there.
Interesting. Do you folks have to ever do rollbacks?
Um, I'm sure it happens. I don't have a number. I think that it's a very rare. We'll normally do a patch release and just kind of cut it over. And I don't think in the last few years we've had a fully released version that had kind of something that fundamentally needed to be brought back. You can't really roll back. It's already on people's devices. So
Right.
it is more the like, don't update to that version.
Right. That's why I was also curious. Like, I
Mm,
think mobile release cycles are a little bit more complicated versus web.
yeah. Yeah. I think that's where having those experiment wraps and that nature is really helpful, is just the, if it's downloaded on the person's device, it's there forever. And, you know, can't really guarantee their update frequency and such. So making sure that you have some controls over anything that you didn't want to release.
Amazing. I know we are coming close to time, so maybe one last question I'll ask you, Ryan, is what's in the future of iOS? Like, are there certain things in terms of the evolution of the iOS platform itself that you're excited about, maybe, or if you have like any predictions for what's going to happen with iOS, or like not just iOS but rather any mobile development in the near future?
Sure. I don't know if it came up, but my background is in Android development, so I have clear bias there. But I love our iOS friends. I mean, so at Pinterest internally, we've just moved to Twist, and we're really excited to be using this as a platform to better manage our builds. Um, to say Swift is on the horizon feels like I'm living in the past. But I've mentioned this so many times in this project. We're really excited that most of our new code is written in Swift these days. Um, really, to kind of go back to what you mentioned before, I suspect the most interesting pieces are going to be how AI gets incorporated into the coding path. And I think that will happen both on a help me finish this line, help me do this, as well as the larger migrations. But I'm still of the side that where developers are going to have jobs for years to go, and it's going to enhance our productivity and not be like, please write a better Pinterest for me. But I'm sure a viewer at home will prove me wrong there.
Amazing. All right, Ryan. This was a blast talking to you, learning a lot about like history of Pinterest and all the things that go into Pinterest every day. So thank you so much for your time, and really enjoyed this conversation.
Great. It was great talking to you as well. I'd always love to talk about developer productivity, anything in this area.